Okay, we might start.
He's happy, but...
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the historic Jubilee Room in New South Wales Parliament House. We're holding this event in Australia's longest-serving public building, which started its life as the surgeons' quarters of a hospital, built on the back of the colonial rum trade, and is now home of Australia's oldest legislature. I'm Joseph Cho from New South Wales Parliament's Communications, Engagement and Education branch, and I'll be your host this evening, along with the Honourable Matthew Mason-Cox, the President of the Legislative Council. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us. It's wonderful to see you all here. I should note that this event is being streamed live online and that we'll be making the video available once we have completed the edits in a few days' time. Tonight, you'll hear from a panel of members, both from the Legislative Assembly and the Legislative Council, who are party whips. We'll first invite our panellists to introduce themselves and then invite questions from you, our audience, to start what I'm sure will be a fascinating discussion. We'll be taking as many questions as time permits before concluding the event at 6:30 p.m. I'll now ask the Honourable Matthew Mason-Cox, the President of the Legislative Council, to officially open this event. Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Joseph, and welcome everybody tonight. It's wonderful to have you here. It's a very, very special presentation, and we'll get to these wonderful characters behind us in a moment. But first of all, I did want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land upon which Parliament sits, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and acknowledge their elders past and present. And certainly the long history of the site here at Parliament House extends back thousands of years, of course, and it was originally a place where Aboriginal people gathered for custom and tribal means. So it's certainly a lot of history hidden behind the walls of this place as well. So tonight we're talking about Parliament Unpacked, the enforcers of discipline, the role of the party whip. And as you can see, there is a whip on the table as well. But one thing you can be sure of, they don't know how to use a real whip. That belongs to the stockman way out west, and I don't believe any of our current whips qualify. But let's have a closer look at that. Why indeed do we need whips? It's an interesting question in itself, but let me just explain where the term comes from. It comes from the English hunting expression whipper-in, which was the title for the person responsible for preventing the hunting hounds from straying from the pack. And that probably, in a way, gives you a bit of a feel for the key role of the whip to keep the pack together. And they've all got different packs. They come from different parties, and indeed when members are elected to each of the houses, they come in here with generally not a clue about what to do, and there are a lot of responsibilities that are attached to becoming a Member of Parliament. So you suddenly are responsible for an office, for staff, you have all these procedures that apply to you, and of course codes of conduct and ethical responsibility. And then suddenly, in the midst of all that, the bells ring. And you think, what do I do now? And that's where the whips come in. So let us first introduce our esteemed panel. Closest to me is the Honourable Scott Farlow, who is the whip in the Legislative Council for the Liberal Party, or the Coalition. The Honourable Nat Smith, the whip for the government in the lower house, and indeed a very, very, I understand, keen teacher of how to wield the whip. The Honourable Anna Watson, the government whip for the Australian Labor Party whip, and has been a long-standing member for the seat of Shell Harbour. And the Honourable Mark Buttigieg, who is the ALP, or the Labor Party whip, in the upper house, Legislative Council. So again, four very talented whip holders and enforcers of discipline in this place. So I think it's going to be a cracking good discussion tonight. And those jokes aside, I'll leave you in their capable hands. Ask them the difficult questions. Maybe they'll tell you a few stories about this place. And indeed, I wish we all depart with a bit more knowledge about why it's so important that we have whips in both Houses of Parliament. So with those few words, Joseph, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present. We will now hear from our panel members. I'll first invite each member to speak for a few minutes and tell us a little about themselves, perhaps how they got into Parliament and something of what they did before, and also a little bit about what they do in Parliament with a focus on their roles as whips. I respectfully ask members to keep it brief, to 3 to 4 minutes perhaps, as we would like to maximise the time available for questions. Now, after the introductions are done, I'm going to be inviting questions from the audience, both from this room and from the chat box for those who are watching online. So please start thinking about them now. Now, in thinking about your questions, I would like to remind everybody that the aim of the Parliament Unpacked series is to explore the parliamentary process, the role of members and our democracy itself, rather than to debate topical political issues of the day. We can leave that for question time, and that, of course, resumes again from tomorrow. So let's begin. So I would like to start with Mr. Farlow, and perhaps we can go around the table after then. Mr. Farlow.
Thank you very much, Joseph, and thanks very much everyone for being here tonight. My name's Scott Farlow. I'm the Legislative Council Whip, and I'm relatively new to the role, coming in February, as Nat did as well in the lower house, following the election of Premier Perrottet and some of the changes in the arrangements we had then. Interestingly enough, I actually a little bit in awe, because my first whip is in the room today as well, Dr. Peter Phelps, who was the whip when I came in. I must be careful of anything that I say about the role of the whip, because much of it will be fashioned by some of the things that he said to me when I first came in to this place about the role of the whip, particularly the part shop steward, part enforcer part, which I think was one of the terms that he coined in the early days, and that's very much the role of the whip is a two-way role in our system in Australia. Or at least in the way that it has come in here in New South Wales Parliament, because it is one that reflects up as well as down. Of course, we do derive the role of the whip from the UK, and the whipper-in is the President, of course, acknowledged. And they have certain tools and certain expectations, the 3-line whip, the 2-line whip, and the like. And the loss of party whip is something, if you do cross the floor in a 3-line whip in the UK. Within the Liberal Party in Australia, and particularly within New South Wales, there are certain rules that are written into our party room rules, which allow members to be able to cross the floor or to be able to vote freely, and there are certain provisions by which they have to enact to be able to remain a member of the party while still being able to do that. One of those is notifying the party room, and if there's not enough time or if circumstances don't allow, notifying the party whip and the party leader. So there aren't as many tools for us as there are for some other parties, and I'm sure Anna and Mark will talk about some of the tools that they've got in their arsenal in being able to enforce discipline as well. So a lot of the role when it comes to enforcing that discipline is to make sure that events don't necessarily occur where somebody would want to cross the floor between ministers and party members when they may express some discomfort with legislation before the House, or express a particular view which may be against the party's view on certain items. And of course, as we've seen in recent years, that may not be able to be avoided, and members will move across the aisle. So how I came to this role, and I should say as well, in terms of the role of the party whip, most people, when you tell them you're the whip, they will think of this that Nat has brought along. But the second thing they'll think of is either Francis Urquhart or Frank Underwood from House of Cards, whether you like the UK or the Australian version. I must say that the role is, at least in my experience so far, very different from those roles. I don't have dirt files. I don't have a stamper. I haven't thrown anyone in front of a train or off the Houses of Parliament. But it is certainly a role which is both very organisational and being able to ensure the smooth flow of the House and Parliament. But it's also a role which, and I think I'd probably speak for all here, is one where you work pretty constructively with people across the aisle as well in trying to actually manage how Parliament works and what happens in the place. And the most common common question you get asked is, what time are we finishing? And it's a question you usually don't have the answer to either. But it's the question you get asked by every member, no matter how junior, no matter how senior, every single day, what time are we finishing? So my background before coming to this role, so I've served in the Parliament since 2015 in the Upper House. I served as the Parliamentary Secretary to the Premier and to the Treasurer and for COVID recovery during that time. Prior to coming in here, I worked in the private sector in public affairs, ran my own small business for a while, am a trained lawyer, never really practiced, and worked in politics, including for the person sitting next to me's father when he was the Shadow Attorney General and the member for Epping, and for a Leader of the Opposition as well, and have been very involved in Liberal Party politics from when I joined at university and through the Young Liberal movement as well. So that's my story, that's my role of the whip, and very happy to discuss it more.
Well, thank you, Scott. My name's Nathaniel Smith, the member for Wallandilly, and I'm the Government Whip. It's the Government Whip, not the Chief Government Whip, which the Federal Parliament title is, and in the UK Parliament. Obviously, the LA is quite a bit different from the LC. Scott is the LC whip, I'm the LA whip, and I work very closely with Anna, the opposition whip. And it has been trying times in the last few months, especially with a lot of the COVID restrictions that have come into the Parliament and dealing with this pandemic over the last 2 years. And that makes the whip's job extremely complicated in terms of we have rapid antigen testing as people come in here each day on a working day, and all of a sudden you could be 5 members of Parliament down. And then you're organising pairs with the opposition, and the opposition could be a couple of members down. And that affects a lot of things. Our job is not just about discipline, it's running legislation and speakers and a list of speakers that speak on different pieces of legislation. Some of those members of Parliament might have notices of motion on a Thursday, and if they're out for 7 days, that one expires or it's postponed and then the next one comes up. So there's a lot of logistical challenges, especially when you're confronted with a pandemic. And I think that's probably been the biggest learning curve for myself and Anna. Anna for the last 2 years and myself from February this year. It's made it, especially if you have legislation that goes late into the night and then you're organising speakers and pairs for the next day. So in terms of my role, I'm obviously the Secretary of the Liberal Party Room up on level 12 when we have party room meetings every Tuesday. The Labor Party will have their party caucus meetings on a Tuesday morning as well. In that role, obviously it's my job to call party room, to take notes at party room and enforce discipline in the party room. And then also to enforce discipline amongst members, especially when it comes to divisions, to make sure every member turns up. If they don't, they'll be in my office and they won't leave with a smile on their face. And to make sure members are down here, ministers are down here, down in the House for when they need to speak in a reply speech to a bill or introducing a piece of legislation to the House. So there's a lot involved. Think of it a bit like a director of a play where you have Act 1, Scene 2, Scene 3, and when someone's away or someone's missing, things can happen. So as an opposition whip, as a government whip, sometimes we've got speeches ready to go to extend something, and you've got to jump in and use your creative language, sometimes last 10 to 15. So we work very closely together, the opposition and the government whip, because our role is to keep the place running. But also to make sure that there's discipline in the House and we work together to make sure it's very smooth. Obviously, as the member for Wallandilly, my area covers the Wallandilly Shire and the Southern Highlands. Before Parliament, I've got quite an interesting work history. I worked for a planning minister as a senior advisor. Before that, I ran a senator's office in the federal Parliament. I was a councillor at local government level. And before that, I did PR and marketing for several years. And before that, I was in the building construction industry and had my own plumbing business. So I've had an interesting employment coming into this place, and through that I believe I've met a lot of different people from different fields, and it's an advantage as a local member being able to understand different things by working on a work site and working in a boardroom, in a corporate boardroom. You can add a lot of things to sort out people's problems. So, and before that, my father was a member of Parliament as well, and a lot of sort of people think, oh, did you follow your father's footsteps? Well, actually, that's wrong. I was in the Young Liberals, and I talked Dad into running for the seat of Epping, which he still blames me for this day. He's 8 years in Parliament. He served as the Shadow Attorney General and the Attorney General in the O'Farrell government, and he still blames me for it. So, yes, I was in the Young Liberals with Scott as well, and that's a little bit about me.
Well, can I start by saying how beautiful this building is? I'm sitting in this room just looking around, and I'm sure each and every one of you would feel the same. We get to come to this place to work every single day that Parliament is sitting, and there's not one day that I don't walk into this place and just go, this place is amazing. It's a real privilege to be here, but it's even more of an honour to serve your community in the New South Wales Parliament. And I am the member for Shellharbour, the very best electorate in New South Wales, the most beautiful electorate in New South Wales, and I'm just putting that on the record. Yeah, you were too. I'll start with my background. As all good Labor MPs, I came straight from the union movement. My grandparents were members of the Communist Party. They were very strong in the Communist Party. As a little girl growing up, I have a twin brother. They ran the union rooms in Sussex Street, and we would paint the windows black for the meetings, which were illegal. We knew every song of solidarity, even though we didn't know what we were singing. So that stays with you. And I think most people, most members who come into this place come into here with all good intentions because they want to serve their communities. And that's the number one reason we're all here, regardless of what colour you are, if you're a member of the Liberal Party, the Labor Party, the Greens, or another independent. So coming into this place, the majority of us do come in with all good intentions. The role of the whip, for me, wasn't a hard one to step into. I had come from the union movement. I worked for the USU for about 13 or 14 years. I was the first female official within the southern half of New South Wales, going to gate meetings where there might be 200, 300, 400, 500 men standing there waiting for me to sort out their problems. So you had to grow a pretty thick skin pretty quick. And so coming into here wasn't so bad, although it's a different kind of environment. So being the whip is, you're the first one here, so when you walk in, you turn the lights on, and you're the last one to leave. It is very difficult sometimes to deal with a whole bunch of MPs because they've all got different personalities. They've all got their own issues. So outside of your life as an MP, you do have families and you do have issues just like everybody else. You are a mentor. You are also a psychologist. You are the keeper of all secrets. So if an MP comes to you with an issue, a personal one, then you keep that in the vault and you never let it go. In terms of the actual role, I do work closely with Nathaniel. I've been told that I'm like a flamingo in heels running down the corridor to make sure that everybody turns up for the division. But it's more than turning up for the division. It's making sure that I'm always watching what Nathaniel's doing. I'm counting the numbers in his party every 5 minutes. Who's here? Who's left the building? So I'm always looking for a chance, a strategic chance or opportunity to win a division to get one up on him. And we're pretty close. We're pretty close to getting there. Yeah, I think it could be this week. So, it's very strategic and you are always looking to get the best out of any situation you can. It is a job where you are constantly watching the screen to see what's going on. Our offices are very close to the chamber, and that is because we need to be there very quickly if or when something happens. It is very difficult. MPs, big egos, let's face it, we wouldn't be here if we didn't have that, and we do. But it's very difficult to manage sometimes those personalities it's very difficult to make sure that when a member comes to you and says that they just want to go across the road to get something to eat, well, no, once you're in the building, you stay in the building, and you don't leave the building unless you come, well, from my party anyway, from the ALP, you don't leave this building unless you ask me. And the answer is always no, unless it's for something very, very urgent, so that they already know not to come. We do have our caucus meetings, every Tuesday, as Nathaniel said, and the way that the whips are elected in the Labor Party is a little bit different to how the whips are elected in the Liberal Party. Our caucus decides who they want as their whips. And I think that's very democratic, because that's what the Labor Party is all about, and that's what we do. I have been doing this job now for, I think, about 6 years as opposition whip. I'm looking forward to 2023, and when I'll be the government whip, and we will win the election in 2023. It's pretty one early. But look, it is a great honour to be the whip. But it is a big job, because you do have the responsibility of your own electorate. So, I've got one of the biggest electorates in New South Wales, over 80,000 now, and being the opposition whip. It's something I take seriously. It's not just a job, it's a way of life. It doesn't ever end. Saturdays and Sundays the same. You're taking phone calls from MPs. So, it's a very hands-on job. It is something that you could never, ever know all of the ins and outs of it. I do work very closely with Nathaniel, because we have to make sure that the House is running very smoothly and that there's no problems. And I see that as our main role. And the way we do that is by good communication. There's a level of trust between us that we have to, take one another's word. If I say I'm going to give a pair, then I do it. And I know that Nathaniel is the same. And that's how we work in the lower house in New South Wales. And I know it's a little bit different up in your place, Mark, but in the LA, it has to work like that, because it's just so fast and it's just moving so quickly. But I really enjoy it. I meet with the leader of the Labor Party, Chris Minns, from time to time to talk about tactics and things like that. So that's always in the back of your mind, and what's going on at the time within the media. So could I just finish by thanking each and every one of you for coming tonight, but also you, Joseph, for organising this. It's I think it's great. So well done to you.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank my colleagues for blowing the 3-minute ceiling. I feel a lot more comfortable now. I've done a few of these now, maybe 2 or 3 maybe, I think, and this is by far the biggest crowd, so it's testament to the fact that, we've got exceptional drawcard power here, a stellar cast of presenters tonight, or it could be the promotional capabilities of Joseph, I'm sure. Look, my background is I'm an electrician by trade. I worked for the majority of my working life with what used to be called the Sydney County Council, which is now Ausgrid, as an electrician. I became an operator, which is the people that turn the power on and off to make it safe for other people to work on and restore supply during storms. I did electrical trade and then engineering at TAFE, our great TAFE institution. The majority of it was St George TAFE. And then I subsequently did an arts degree in political science and then an honours degree in economics, and joined the Labor Party joined the Union in 1983, and then joined the Labor Party in 1993, and then just got exceedingly more interested in politics, particularly because of the university studies that I did and the people I met in the Labor Party. And then I ran for the federal seat of Cook, which you might be familiar with, both in 2004 and 2007, somewhat more successfully in 2007. We cut the margin in half, which I was very proud of. That was largely thanks to Kevin Rudd, actually. And then I got elected to Sutherland Council in 2008, was a councillor there for 4 years, 2008 to 2012. And then I joined the electrical, very similar background to Anna actually, joined the Electrical Trades Union in 2012 as an organiser, and I stayed there from 2012 to 2019. They were quite instrumental, along with several other unions, not least of which was Anna's union, the USU, in getting me onto what we call the upper house ticket. So when you're put a certain point up on a group voting ticket, there's a good chance you'll get elected because of the nature of upper house voting, and that's how I got elected. So yeah, it's been a very long and rewarding journey. I'm very, very pleased and honoured to be a member of the Legislative Council. It's been very, very rewarding. It's been everything I could have ever imagined and more, to be frank. And I was very, very gratified when I was asked by the upper house leader, my colleague Adam Searle, and our then leader Jodie McKay, if I would like to be whip and nominated, put forward to the caucus. Caucus said yes. So I've been the whip since 2019. And as my colleagues have pointed out, it's I think it was Scott who was quite an accurate description, and the advice he got from his predecessor, where it was part enforcer, part shop steward. That is, in a representative sense, one of your roles is to represent your colleagues and any grievances they might have, either within the party or within the parliament, or things that are going wrong. But it's also a very organisational role in terms of logistics, particularly in the upper house, where, because we have a system of quite an extensive and elaborate system of committees, not least of which is budget estimates, a lot of work has to go into organising those budget estimates hearings, working out who's going to go on what committee, for how long, what the shifts are. If you're going to say that you're going to be on a committee questioning the Minister for Transport, for example, we can't have you not turn up, or turn up for 20 minutes and then take off without telling us, because it causes problems, and it's quite embarrassing for the opposition if that happens. So there's quite a few logistics involved, a lot of shuffling involved. Of course, we have staff who help us with that, which make a massive difference to how the office is run, and we're very fortunate to have very great staff who know their jobs, which makes our life a lot easier. In terms of what I expected when I came into the role compared to what it is, again, the similarities with Anna are quite strong. Being an organiser, there is a degree of natural fit where you're used to telling people what to do because you like things organised and you like things to go smoothly. And that's one of the functions of the whips, as was pointed out. There's a mutual self-interest in the House, both houses, both the LA and the LC, whereby unless the whips get together, and President obviously plays a key role in this too, there's a mutual self-interest to limit the amount of unknowns so that the House business flows nicely. So there's quite a lot of cooperation, perhaps much more than you'd imagine, between the two whips and the various office holders. But I was pleasantly surprised by the degree of cooperation between those two roles in the upper house. I didn't think it would be quite so cooperative, but then over time I learnt that if that wasn't the case, the business of the House would soon unravel and it would be quite dysfunctional. It's a very, very rewarding role, as has been outlined. The pair system is very, very essential to the functioning of the House. As you can imagine, you've got a couple of hundred MPs who have all got social commitments, ministerial commitments, families, people get sick, all sorts of things happen. If you didn't have the pair arrangement whereby the government and the opposition had an agreement to pair people out for a vote in order to keep the vote balanced and fair, then again the whole system would break down, because people would capriciously take advantage of someone's being unwell or being unavailable, and the whole thing would be quite antagonistic. So the pair system is quite essential. And I guess the other thing is, again, being in a position where you have to make sure that your speakers are down in the House, because, I mean, I guess from an outside perspective, everyone assumes that people have got to be in the House all the time for every piece of business. I guess it's a superficial assumption you make when you see Parliament operate, that why is the chamber empty sometimes, or why hasn't it got the full suite of MPs in there? The reason is that MPs have a myriad of things to get on top of and do, particularly if you're a minister. And if you spent all your time in the chamber trying to digest everything that was going on, you wouldn't get any work done. So we have MPs drifting in and out all the time, and of course that creates the issues of making sure that they're down there for divisions, but not only divisions, to be down there when it's their turn to speak on a committee report or on a bill or in a certain debate. The other function, of course, is question time, whereby the whips have to coordinate the questions and the order of questions where members get to ask each question. It just doesn't happen, automatically. Questions are all pre-prepared by the opposition and handed out accordingly, and we keep a tally of who asked what questions so that there's a degree of equity. So it's a very, very interesting role, a lot of logistical work, a lot of organising, and absolutely enjoyable. I think I'll leave it there because I'm sure we're keen to get into questions, and I note that I didn't quite go to the other 7 minutes that my colleagues did, but
I think
You're in the upper house too. I'm impressed.
thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very
And
much.
thanks for
Mr.
coming.
Valentine.
It's great.
And thank you all the members for sharing your journeys with us. I must admit that I did do a lot of research for tonight. I watched all seasons of The House of Cards. I'm a little
UK and US versions? Or?
only the US version, I must admit.
You missed out.
First.
I must admit that I am quite happy to hear that it's not quite like that, and a little bit disappointed too. But I feel like that was a great introduction to everybody here. And now we have time to take questions from the audience. I'll do this in turn. So I'll first come to our in-person audience in the room and then turn to the online audience. So do I have a volunteer or volunteers? Question. Yes, we do have a roving mic. Megan. Thank you.
You do that one.
That's a really good question, and thanks for asking, because it is something that it happens daily when we're in this place. I can say that the minor parties, so the Greens and the Shooters and Fishers and the Independents, often come to my office for advice, wanting to know when they can speak and when they can't, and those sorts of things. We work very closely with them, but also at arm's length. It's all about voting because at the moment with the numbers in the House are quite tight. I think both Labor and the Liberals, will try to romance them a little bit. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But I think it is important that we make sure, and I always do that, for instance, the Greens are getting their fair share of speaking times, and the same with the Shooters and Fishers. You may not agree with everything they've got to say, but that's democracy. That's how it works. And they've been elected in their own rights and have every opportunity that the rest of us have. But being from a major party, of course, we've got that big push behind us. But I think that with the independents, it actually works quite well. I'm not too sure whether they come to your office, Nathaniel, but they email me I've had emails only this week that a few of them are unwell and they're not coming in. Even though I'm not their whip, they're letting me know that they won't be here, and I think that's a very good sign.
Yeah, just to follow on what Anna said, they do have a person designated in the tabled office, which does help especially when we had a lesser amount of people in the chamber earlier this year. We only had a maximum of 60 odd, so we had to have so many from the opposition, so many from the government, and only so many from the crossbench. So some of them set up in their offices during question time. But now all those requirements are now gone. There's no density limits anymore. But they would come into my offices as well. They would talk to the leader of opposition business, the leader of the government, Alistair Henskins of government business. So there's that regular dialogue going on all the time, and I would regularly go into the chamber and go, you next, just to make sure that, and I'll let whoever's in the chair know that either the Greens are up next and it's Shooters and Fishers, then it's back to us again. So they're getting an equal opportunity to take part in debate.
I might just add a little upper house perspective on this, because in the upper house I think that while it's not new about crossbenchers and independents in the lower house, but in the upper house it's really entrenched. So it's effectively, in a sense, a third goes to the crossbench, or a little bit less than a third. So when it comes to question time, for instance, the crossbench rotation in our house is a little under a third of the questions and the like. So the upper house, actually, out of Mark Latham's office now, he has a staff member who somewhat coordinates all the crossbench in terms of their question and speaking order for certain items. And that includes the Greens, One Nation, a very diverse range of parties. And of course, it's not on a political sense, but it's just on an operation of business sense. We also in the upper house have a what is now going to be known as the House Business Procedure Committee meeting. So Wednesday is reserved in our house for private members' business, and that effectively is all members of the House, particularly the opposition and the crossbench, being able to put motions forward or bills forward for debate. And that actually, if Dr Phelps is still here, is somewhat of an invention that he pioneered when he was a whip, as the whips meeting, which is effectively to work out the order of business for that day. To be frank, there's a little bit of to and fro that goes on in those meetings, depending on how well I do my job, whether there's more to or fro than not. Sometimes we can go into those meetings and effectively have it all sorted out, and what I put before the meeting is all fine and accepted. Sometimes it can take us a little bit more, and we can be going for a while back and forth. But there's generally, and that is, the representatives on that represent all of the parties. So it's myself and my Deputy Whip from the National Party, Mark and the Deputy Whip from the Labor Party, and then a representative from all of the crossbench parties to work out the business for that day. I don't know if Mark wants to add anything.
Oh, look, the only added perspective I'd add is, again, in terms of the difference between the Legislative Council, which is a house of review, as opposed to the Legislative Assembly, they're fundamentally different beasts, and that also affects the role of the relationship with the crossbenchers too. So in the LA, although of recent times it's a lot tighter, it's whilst the media focus is all on the LA, the reality is, from opposition, actually a lot more goes on in the upper house in terms of whipping legislation into shape, getting amendments through, knocking back legislation, because the numbers are quite set in the lower house. The government has the majority and the confidence, so it inevitably wins all the votes. That's just by dent of numbers. In the upper house, we have 17 government members, 14 opposition, which means the gap's only 3. So when you think about the composition of the crossbenchers in the upper house, you have 2 shooters and fishers, you have 3 Greens, an independent in Justin Field, 2 Animal Justice and 2 One Nation. Now, depending on which way they go, the opposition wins votes all the time, which means that we have to have very good relationships with that crossbench to keep them on board to win those votes. Often there's a common self-interest with things for calls for papers, where inevitably the crossbench vote with the opposition, so we get our calls for papers through and we carry out that function of accountability. But the whip's role can be quite interesting in tight votes, where you're relying on those crossbenchers to come across. So, as the others have pointed out, you do have to have relationships with those crossbenchers and talk to them all the time.
Can I just add, there's also a Standing Orders Committee, of which we, Nathaniel and I, are both on, and in that Standing Orders Committee, they do have a representative of the crossbench that represent the Greens, the shooters and fishers and the independents in the LA, to make sure that that their point of view is heard and acted upon. And I think that that's a really great thing that that they are involved in that, because that does show, that they are being represented, even though they're a minority. They are a part of this place. So I think the Standing Orders Committee is a really great place for those crossbenchers to be heard.
Thank you very much, members. It looks like it's a bit quiet online, so I might return to the room for a question. Yes, we've got a question here. Megan? Side. Thank you.
Thank you for a very informative session. My question is, what advice would you give to your former self starting out in your role in comparison to now? So what has been one of the greatest lessons that have each emerged through a major setback?
So I might just repeat that question for the online audience. So the question was, what advice would you give yourself in starting out in the role? What are the greatest lessons that you have learned since commencing in the role?
Well, my greatest lesson, and I picked it up reasonably quickly, but if I knew from the beginning, don't ever take anyone for granted. Don't assume that because the government has a certain position that you can't talk to them or they won't agree to compromise. Same with the crossbenchers. Same with any human being, I guess. If you just don't take people on for granted, always give them the time of day, talk to them, because sometimes you assume that they've got a certain position and it's not necessarily the case.
I think for me, I would have, and I did actually, consult with the two whips prior to myself taking that position to get their perspective on what the role was, so I could understand it more, what worked for them, what didn't. And then when I found out what I needed to find out, I changed a whole bunch of things anyway. But it still gave me the information that I needed, to understand that role. The other thing I would say would be probably eat well, get loads of sleep, drink lots of water, and look after yourself, because it does knock you around, and it is difficult because, you just don't go home and forget about, you just can't relax. You're so wound up. And then, I don't know about you guys, but I'm taking notes all the time. I'm writing things down, and, I've got a whole laundry list of things to do before I even get back the next morning. So I think looking after yourself is really important. But I think listening is a huge part of our job. I would say 70% listening, 30% talking.
Beware of political landmines, because there's always traps in this place, from the opposition, from others, from even people that may not want you in that position, and that's politics. And it's always being prepared, having a plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D, because you could be preparing for a day and all those things, someone makes a decision upstairs and everything drastically changes. So it's being super organised, and I think coming from a campaign manager's point of view, I've ran campaigns since 2000, and my dad's campaign and John Alexander's, a lot of federal, state and local government campaigns. You've just got to have everything ticked off and be prepared for anything. And as Anna said, listening and getting ready for the next day and having things prepared and having good staff. I know Colleen in Anna's office, I've got Asher in my office, and we're trying to look at things. We're trying to look 2-3 weeks ahead, because if something happens, all of a sudden that might be on this Thursday, and you don't want to be caught unaware, because if something goes wrong in the house, you're to blame.
I guess from my perspective, it's pretty similar to Nat's, but it's, dot your I's and cross your T's. You can't take anything for granted in terms of, and because of the pace of change, things can change very quickly, and things you might have left only a minute ago may have changed quite remarkably within that short space of time. So always go back through and check whatever's in front of you, because there could be just some things that have changed, and that could change the whole nature of the game and the place. So being able to make sure you're always dotting your I's, crossing your T's on everything that comes before you.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have a question? Yes, we have a question over here. Sorry, just for the online audience, the question was about the difference between a sitting week and a non-sitting week.
There's a pretty big difference. What happens when you're in Parliament, and you try to relate that back to your electorate? People aren't tuning in to what we're doing here all the time, and the same goes for when we're in Parliament and I go back to my electorate, and I don't report back on what's happened in my role as the whip. It's one of those positions that is more mechanical than it is electoral or campaigning wise. So in terms of that, it couldn't be further apart. But it is something that you are, once you're the whip, you're the whip whether you're in Parliament or you're not. And there are a lot of issues that come your way and information that you may not like, but you have to rise above it every single time, because if you don't, I think that's when you'll get into trouble. I know that's when you'll get into trouble. And as I said before, I'm always looking for an opportunity to win a division. And, so we can do a victory lap around the chamber, and that time is coming.
It hasn't happened yet.
But in terms of what goes on in this place, nobody in your electorate really knows. I don't think. That's what I believe. But it doesn't mean it's not important. It is. But the role in Parliament, once you go back to your electorate, there's nothing that correlates between it, only the admin and the paperwork and the filing and making sure that everything's smooth. Other than that, it doesn't go hand in hand at all.
Yeah, just to add to that, it's obviously, you use that time when Parliament's not sitting to get ready for the next few weeks, because there's a lot of stuff going on here, especially on Thursdays. For a government, that's the toughest day for a Thursday, because it's opposition business. So we've got to make sure that members of Parliament who have got a nom up or have got, and ministers' offices, if there's a private members' bill, that there's plenty of speeches and how the government's going to approach this. There's obviously the leaders of the House do their negotiation with independents and crossbenchers and things like that. So there's a lot of prep work beforehand, because you can't just sort of make it up as you go along and sort of just like, we'll wing it. It doesn't work like that. You got to have, as I said before, you got to have A, B, C and D ready. So our advisors, Anna has an advisor and so do I, that does a lot of that groundwork, and we just make sure that the MPs are notified what's coming up and what they're going to be ready for.
They're chalk and cheese, really, in both from a member's perspective, but also in terms of what you actually do. So your effects psychologically, I guess, it's just 2 weeks of utter hecticness, to use an incorrect grammatical term. Yeah, absolutely. You get a week into it. But it's very, very, very. You're running on adrenaline, because there's a ton of meetings to do during the day. Then you're in the House. You've got to keep an eye on your members, make sure people are down for question time. Get across the legislative agenda. There might be a contentious bill. So it's stressful but rewarding, because at the end of the day you feel like, wow, that was a decent day's work. I'm ready for bed. And then during a non-sitting week, it's an opportunity, I guess. So the system that upper house MPs have is because you haven't got a set constituency, unlike the member for Shellharbour or the member for Wallandilly, your job is to represent the whole state. So what the parties generally do is allocate non-held seats for you to steward. That is, to go out and see Labor Party branches and have a Labor presence or a Liberal presence, as the case may be, in a non-held seat. And that takes up a fair bit of time too. And then you've got whatever campaigning activities you might like to get in. And I personally find it a great relief from the House to get out and about and be involved in any number of campaigns that I might be participating in. So it's a very nice contrast, to be honest. It's one thing you can say about this job, and in that context that the gentleman asked the question, it is anything but boring, because there's always a variety, and that House sitting, non-sitting period helps with all that as well. But obviously you've got the legislative agenda you have to deal with. For the whips, it's a little bit different too in terms of the upper house, because sometimes in a non-sitting week we'll have to deal with budget estimates or hearings, which our officers have to coordinate. So that's kind of gets quite logistical and tedious as well. But if you've got good staff like we have, a lot of the headache is taken away for you.
I was going to say pretty similar to Mark. It's the difference between sleep and no sleep, really, when it comes to sitting weeks and non-sitting weeks in the upper house. That is changing a little bit, because we're moving to a harder German at 10:30. But Mark's quite right. It's chalk. Yeah.
Enterprise.
Mark's quite right. It's chalk and cheese between what we do. It is a frantic pace during sitting weeks. Your first meetings sort of start at 7:30 in the morning, and we have typically been sitting till 12:30 for much of it. and lots of meetings through the day. During my time in the whip, which has only been a couple of months, for the first couple of weeks I didn't have a deputy whip because we had some changes over with the deputy presidency in the LC and a new member coming in. Then I had my deputy whip come into place as a completely new member to the Parliament, and then he ended up getting COVID, so I had no deputy whip either. So I was pretty much in the chamber 24/7 dealing with everything, and then would come back up to the office very briefly before we finished up. So it's been a bit of a different pace. On non-sitting weeks, you can plan for the sitting weeks ahead. Mark's quite right. In the upper house, we have a lot of committee activity, which means that Mark and I sit on a lot of committees ourselves, but also organising government participation in committees, and when you get the text from people watching going, where is such and such, or there's only one member who's there and where are they, and we've got a lot of conflicting obligations for members as well when it comes to either their committee activity, their parliamentary secretary work, or even other committees coming up against each other. So there's a few things to manage there as well. So it's a different pace, but there's still a job to be done.
Do you know what's great about this is that we operate under the Westminster system, and I don't think there is any better system than that. It's not ideal, you know, it comes with its own problems, but I would much prefer to be operating under this system than, say, what happens in America, which I think would be a nightmare. I think all my colleagues would agree that this is a great system in which we operate. Even though it's messy, it just works.
Thank you very much, members, for those interesting responses. We've received a few questions from our online audience in the meanwhile. So here's the first one. What role do you play, if any, in conscience votes?
Oh, look, I'm happy to kick off.
Yeah, go for it, Scott.
So we just went through voluntary assisted dying in the upper house. Effectively, the role that I played as the government whip with the government hat on was to tell members that I'd be doing nothing, effectively, except for a broad range through that of, you know, this is where we're going to debate or the like, and telling them the broad outline. But when it came to divisions or the like, I wasn't taking the role of sending out any messages to members as to be in the chamber. I think Mark and I were both appointed tellers for opposite sides of the votes, but on the side of our conscience, which just happened to be opposite sides. But I was probably working with more closely with a lot of Labor members on that vote than I was on Liberal members, and Mark was probably working closer with Liberal members than Labor members at times on that vote as well. So it does change the nature quite a bit when it comes to the conscience vote, and for instance, myself and my deputy whip are on different sides of that vote. So it is an interesting environment when you sort of have that breakdown of party discipline on those things.
Look, with a conscience vote, you don't get many. So when you do, then you know you exercise your own conscience. I don't know what other MPs do, but I reach out to my electorate just to test the waters to see how they're feeling and what they want me to do as their representative in this place. And that weighs heavily on me. I take notice of it, and I do base my decision on it, because at the end of the day, we are the mouthpiece for those communities, and we must act in what they're telling us. That said, I do take conscience votes very, very seriously. It was the same in the LA, with the voluntary assisted dying, which was, quite a big campaign that we saw went on for a long time. I supported that legislation, but people in my party did not. And that was their right. And that's what a conscience vote is. And like you, Scott, I said nothing. It was up to each individual to do entirely what they wanted to do and vote how they wanted to vote. And I was actually telling as well with the then whip, the member for Terrigal, and he and I were both on the same side for the first time ever, which was quite, it was quite unusual. But you don't get many of them, so I take it seriously.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I take conscience votes extremely seriously. I think I wasn't the government whip at the time last year. I was doing the tellers for the no's against my party whip and Anna. And yeah, it was a mixed bag with Labor members, Liberal members, National Party members and others that voted against it. And obviously it's about your conscience as well, but obviously you've got to listen to your electorate. And my electorate was pretty 50-50 on the abortion debate. Before that, it was very much about 99 against. It was very high against in terms of emails and phone calls I got to my office. It was incredibly, and then on the other side of the Sydney, it was totally opposite. So you've got to listen to your electorate, but you've also got to, it's a conscience vote for it's on your conscience as well, how you're going to be voting. And yeah.
The only thing I'd add is that it's a relaxing time for the whips because there's no pairs. You don't have to worry about who's coming down to the chamber because
that's actually true. Yeah.
There's no party. The whips actually have no. Well, I was going to say they do have a role in the sense that if there's speakers who want to speak on the bill, they would normally still come to you to organise that, but there's no authority over you making sure that they're there and voting and all the rest of it. So that's one thing. The other thing we didn't touch on too was the concept of when you don't have a conscience vote, our jobs, particularly Anna's and mine, but it's similar for the Liberal Party. There's a concept of caucus solidarity. Mm. So once you go into that caucus and you make a collective decision, no matter how fiercely you disagree, you walk out of there and you're bound by that decision, and there are quite severe consequences in our party. You can be expelled for breaking caucus solidarity and going against that decision. So whilst it sounds like this big drama, and it can be at times because of human personality and all the rest of it, by and large people do the right thing. So, the bells ring and people come down and you just got to make sure that they're all there. But yeah.
Thank you very much. So I'll turn to the second online question, and I have a feeling, just judging by the time, that this might have to be the final question for the day. And I'm aware that a few members of the audience indicated to me that they would like to ask a question, and I'm sorry about that. So the second online question is, what aspect of your role surprised you the most when you first started?
I'll kick off. It's dealing with distractions. So distractions like a joint sitting of Parliament, where you're on a Thursday, it's a joint sitting, there's a new upper house member coming into the House. It could be for the Liberal Party, it could be for the National Party, it could be Labor, it could be Greens, because especially just after a federal election, someone might have moved to the federal Parliament. And what happens is at around about 10:30, Parliament stops, there's a long bell, you head over to the other side, and all this, but the clock's still ticking, because certain private members' times is 90 minutes, then NOM's time. So when you go back into the Parliament, you've got to make sure with the clerks you've got all your ducks lined up. In terms, because you might naturally think, we'll finish private members at 15 past 12 or 5 past 12, and instead it might be earlier, it might be later. So it's watching out for those timings, especially on a Thursday. That can surprise you and bite you, because all of a sudden you've got 2 minutes left and the first nom's speaking, he's not down, he or she's not down in the chamber, and you're panicking trying to slow things up. So yeah, they're the little things that come up and surprise you.
I think for me, the most surprising aspect is the level of collaboration that we work together, even though we're on opposite sides of politics. I'm a very strong Labor member, Nathaniel's a very strong Liberal member, but we work very, very well together, and that was surprising because, you come into this place thinking, those Libs, and you do. But you know what? I can go into and we'll have a cup of tea, and have a chat about what's going on.
Ignore the Nixon posters.
Yeah. I'll just ignore all those silly posters. But the level of, I think, of collaboration and mutual respect for one another for the jobs that we have to do. So it's not personal. It's a very defined role, and personalities just can't come into it, because we have to make sure that this place is running very, very smoothly. Because if it isn't, the finger pointing starts and it's directly at us. So I'm very aware that, you know, we have to be on our game every single minute of the day.
Well, two things, I suppose, and it touches on what my colleagues have just outlined. The pragmatism involved when I first got up there, like, you have this sort of view that it's this adversarial, antagonistic relationship where every single vote's hardly fought over and, you know, no one gives an inch. But it's like, look, Labor's going to support this, the crossbenchers are going to support it, let's just move on and vote and move on to the next item of business. And that level of pragmatism surprised me. The other thing that surprised me, and Nathaniel touched on it, was how quickly you can get caught off guard if you're in that house and you're not thinking about your core business. So if you're on social media thinking, ooh, that Facebook post is doing really great, I just go, and then all of a sudden your questions haven't come down at 5 to 12. Oh, that's right, question time. You can really quickly lose track of what's going on in the house, and things can unravel very quickly. So they're the two things that surprise me. Yeah.
I'd certainly agree with Mark's second assessment, and I've caught myself on that point a few times where I'm quickly, hurriedly messaging the office going, question time, bring down questions. Where are they? I guess I've been in the chamber 7 years before coming to the whip's role, so a lot of the observations that the other panellists have made I would agree with, but they probably didn't surprise me because I'd observed sort of that cooperation. The thing that probably surprised me the most coming in is the number of pair requests I get.
Actually, that's very good.
I must say, having in my 7 years probably put 3 in myself, I was surprised by the amount that do come through to your office from members. Sometimes dubious reasons of why pairs are requested, but that was certainly the thing that surprised me most in coming to the role, just the volume of pair requests and the amount that come through during the week as well. When you think that, oh, this is all settled and done, and Mark and I are even on the floor asking each other for pairs because certain engagements have come up with members. So that certainly is genuinely the thing that surprised me most in the role.
Thank you very much, everyone. And it's 6:30, so just noting the time, I'm afraid that's all the questions we have time for tonight. I note that Parliament is sitting again from tomorrow and that this is a particularly busy period for our panellists. So thank you very much for joining us. It was fascinating to hear how whips work in practice. I would also like to say a big thank you to Mr. President for his welcome and opening comments and for dedicating the time to be here. Perhaps everyone can join me in thanking our elected representatives. I would also like to say thank you to everyone for taking the time to be with us today and for the interesting and thoughtful questions you've asked. I hope you enjoyed the program, and if you did, please forward the video and pass the word to others who might be interested. I'd just like to flag a couple more things before I let you all go. The first is that we have a series of other events planned in Parliament House. One of it will be held on the 27th of July, and it's entitled Federalism, Border and the Pandemic by Professor Anne Toomey of Sydney University. Professor Toomey will be talking about state border closures. Were they permitted by the Constitution? What did the framers of the Constitution intend to happen in such situations? The talk, I'm told, will feature masked men, poisonous snakes, a seized train, a romantic ruse, an angel of death, and an unresolved mystery. So it sounds quite spicy to me. You can find more information on our events on our website, or better yet, we have a newsletter. So if you're interested in being kept up to date, or if you just like cluttering up your inbox, please talk to me after this event, and I'll be happy to assist in signing you up.
Yes.
The second is that we will be emailing each of you a short survey on how you find tonight's event. We would really appreciate it if you could complete it. It really helps us to know what we're doing right or not, and getting your views and suggestions on what else we can do. So thank you again, and I wish you all a good night. Thank you very much.
Change.
Absolutely. Let me know what works and I'll fit in.
All right. Yeah, let's do it this week.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah, well, there you go. A good steal. A good steal.
Well done.
Well done,
Thank you
Joseph.
very much.
Excellent.
Good job, Joseph. Thank you.
Mr. Webb.
Good to see you.
I see where you've gone now from our committees, you know.
Yeah, we stole him
You
away.
stole him.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Hi, Mark.
Hey,
Leave that with me.
Mr. President.
I got the looks good.
I'll learn a few
Thank you
things
for
too.
organising. Did you? Lovely. Can actually go well.
I was looking forward to your first time.
Well done, mate. Well done.
That's good. Very good.
Oh no, I was going to get my. No, I was going to get Ross surprised. I should have said where one of our
reaching out
players
to a lot
comes
more
in the
people too online things too.
Surprised by the VR.